wounds on both his chest and in his back.
This truck is covered in blood.
To solve the case, investigators must trace the crime back to its point of origin.
What's that look like to you?
But first, a code of silence needs to be broken.
You're lying through your teeth.
Get the hell out of my house!
The situation did get rather crazy very quick.
Just the smallest little thing can set people off into a horrible rage.
The first thing you learn as a police detective is people do not respond out of a sense of duty. They don't respond to doing the right thing. They don't respond out of a sense of loyalty. They respond to pressure. Self-preservation is what works.
After a shift change at Fire Station 6, Captain Jerry Binder is making sure his crew is ready for action.
Listen, Chapman, you can't go out there without your gear. I don't want to see that happening again. You got me?
Gotcha, Captain.
Okay, good.
Captain Binder was the captain of this station, and he was a strong leader, had high expectations for his crew members.
Keep that helmet strapped.
Somebody help! Help,
What's wrong,
please? There's a man who's hurt real bad.
Where?
He's outside in the truck.
Ricky, get trauma kit. Meet me outside.
When an emergency responds to the front door of your station, it's an instant go-to-work mode.
So he goes running outside and he finds a shirtless man in the front seat covered in blood.
Hang in there, buddy. We got you. Come on now. Come on.
Give him a cap. There you go. There you go.
Oh, damn it. Let's put pressure on that.
As they lay him down, we see there's stab wounds on both his chest and in his back. We begin direct pressure on those injuries, make sure his airway is clear, stop the bleeding.
Jackie, come here, take over from her, will ya? Code 3, we need help down at Station 6 right away.
As Binder completes the transmission,
What the hell? Hey, lady!
he looks up and sees that the woman is now walking south, away from the scene.
Where you going?
She's walking away very quickly, like she doesn't want to have anything to do with what's going on.
On this particular evening, May 29th of 1984, I was still a patrol sergeant working the evening shift.
Did you help her figure it out?
Yeah, come to find out she's at the wrong house.
Dispatch to 4 Paul 1.
Go for 4 Paul 1.
Code 3 in progress at Fire Station 6. All units requested.
10-4, 4 Paul 1 around. Let's move.
Generally, a patrol sergeant's job is to supervise officers on the street. You are a general practitioner. You respond to any call for service from the police department, from a taxpayer who wants to talk about his pilot light going out in his hot water furnace, or he wants to shoot his neighbor. The spectrum is very broad. I would occasionally respond to calls of a non-serious nature to see how my officers were interacting with members of the public. But if a call of a serious nature came in, I would always respond.
So, any idea what happened here?
I have no clue. Victim was dropped off in this truck out back, covered in stab wounds. Doesn't look good.
You know we're gonna have to cordon off the area.
Hey, do what you gotta do.
If you are responding to a violent crime scene, your first determination is to determine the basic facts.
Want to set up a perimeter?
Yes, sir.
Once those facts are known, I was the deciding factor as to what specialists were required.
4 Paul 1 to dispatch.
There's not much the patrol can do with this, so he called for detectives from the homicide unit to respond.
Not 30 minutes later, Detective John Anderson arrives on scene.
John, Gary?
Evening, Joe. When this first happened, I was the lead detective on this case.
Anderson, a very good detective, well-trained, well-experienced.
So what are we looking at?
Well, the victim showed up in the truck out back. Severe stab wounds to both his back and his chest. We just got notification of his DOA at the hospital.
We got an ID?
He had a wallet on him.
He is, according to the license, James Seaman, 42 years of age. They take that name and they check the registration on the license plate on this truck, and it's his truck.
So he drove himself here? We're not so sure about that. The firefighter said a woman told him about the victim, but she disappeared while they were giving life support.
Did she give a name?
No, but they described her as being Hispanic, dark hair, wearing a red jacket.
Can we get a canvass of the area started?
My guys are already on it.
What's important now is to find this woman. Is she responsible for this attack? Or is she a good Samaritan?
Let's take a look inside the truck yet.
Not yet?
All right, let's do it.
To our knowledge at this juncture, the only crime scene we have as a possibility is the truck in which he arrived in this fire station.
Guy must have been losing blood pretty fast.
There is a lot of blood in this truck.
There was blood caked on the front seat. There was blood on the steering wheel.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot. Looks like transfer blood to me.
Yeah, there's no cast off on the dash or anything either.
It probably wasn't stabbed with the truck then.
No, you're probably right.
So now we don't believe the crime scene is in the vehicle. We have to look elsewhere. One of the things that we utilize in investigations is a trilogy, a connection between the victim, the suspect, and the crime scene. When we're missing the suspect and the crime scene, all we have left is the victim. So it complicates things.
Finding the crime scene is paramount. Unless we find that, we're going to have a very difficult time trying to determine what happened.
So what do you got there? Drywall.
Business cards bearing his name are found in the cab of the vehicle, and the business card says that he is a drywall subcontractor. Generally, drywall work is subcontracted. Most construction companies and builders do not have a drywall crew. They hire someone who has his own crew for a fee to drywall the premise. So Mr. Seaman is in the business of contacting builders, getting contracts to do drywall work, and he then responds with his own crew to do the work.
Hey, sir.
Any luck with the canvas?
Nothing, unfortunately. Dispatch checked with records. Victim's got a wife.
Mary Seaman.
The question becomes obvious, is Mary Seaman the woman in red? We don't know, but we're going to have to find Mary Seaman to find out what she can tell us about her husband, James.
Hey, Joe, you and your guys hold down the fort. We're gonna go look into this.
Can I help you?
Ma'am, we're with CSPD. We're looking for Mary Seaman.
I'm Mary.
The investigators take one look at her and realize she cannot be the woman in red. Mrs. Seaman is not Hispanic, so now those investigators have to give her some very awful news.
Mary, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband is dead.
Wait, what? Oh my God, what happened?
He was murdered.
Of course, when Mary Seaman finds out that her husband has been killed, she is stunned and she is just inconsolable, really. I mean, she just breaks down.
There's a period of time required for someone to pass through that information and be able to still have a conversation. It takes some time.
Mary, I know this is hard. Do you know what your husband was doing earlier today?
No, I don't know. He hasn't actually been living here.
Mary tells police that she and James have been married for 5 years, but things have started to get a little bit rocky. And as a matter of fact, he moved out about a week ago.
Sorry to hear that.
And we had issues in our marriage, but deep down, Jim's got a good heart. He works hard, and he gets along with most everybody.
She says that everybody knows him as Jim. He's a kind of a tough, blue-collar kind of guy, but generally he's got a sensitive side to him.
Do you know if he was having any problems with anyone recently?
I do remember him saying something about there being an issue with some guy who was working for him, but it didn't seem that serious.
Remember the guy's name?
He didn't say.
That, of course, is interesting, but there's really very little information there that's pursuable. So they ask her if Jim has any friends or associates who are Hispanic women.
I can't think of anybody like that. But I don't know who he's been hanging around lately. You'd be better off talking to his friend, John Gibson. That's who he's been staying with.
Thank you, Mary.
We'll see ourselves out.
Detectives head to the home of Jim Seaman's new roommate.
We knew that was maybe a possible crime scene, so we needed to talk to Mr. Gibson.
Yeah. Mr. Gibson? Detective Anderson with CSPD. Why don't we take a look around your house?
My house? For what?
Your friend Jim was found murdered.
Jim? What the hell are you talking about?
Mr. Gibson is totally shocked at this news.
Mind if we take a look around?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Mr. Gibson, when was the last time you saw Jim?
After he got home from work. I want to say maybe around 5 o'clock. All he did was shower and head right back out.
Gibson reports he was going to go to a graduation party at a house in the area that belonged to a friend of his named Rose.
You know who this Rose person is?
Yeah, I met her before. But I don't really know her.
You know what she looks like?
Oh, she's short, got long black hair.
Is she white?
Nah, she's Latina.
So Rose is a Hispanic female. Could she own a red jacket by any chance?
Do you know where Rose lives?
Yeah, over on Charwood.
Excuse me. Place is clear?
We could find no evidence of blood or any indication that there'd been a struggle, but it was obvious that this was not our crime scene.
Appreciate your cooperation.
Yeah.
Let's get a cruiser over there on Charwood.
Yes, sir.
At that point, we wanted to find Rose to see if she was the woman in the red jacket. But we also wanted to see if where she lived was possibly our crime scene.
When they pull up in front of that house, even though it's late at night, there's no car in the driveway, there's no apparent lights, there's no anything. It looks like nobody even lives there. And these detectives are looking at each other like, is this another dead end? And this doesn't look like a place where a party was.
Can I help you?
A woman answered the door. She matched the description of the woman at the fire station.
We're homicide detectives with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Are you Rose?
Yes.
Rose what?
Trejo?
Is that your jacket?
We're standing talking to a Hispanic female, and over her shoulder we see a red jacket. Well, no. 2 and 2 often equals 4. We're standing on the right porch. This investigation begins with the discovery of 42-year-old Jim Seaman dying inside his own truck. A woman drove that truck to that fire station wearing a red jacket. The officers have found the Hispanic female, and they see a red jacket.
Rose, did you drive Jim Seaman to the fire station in his truck this morning?
Yes.
So now they know. They've hit the jackpot.
Is Jim okay?
I'm afraid not. He's dead.
Oh, God. I swear, I don't know what happened.
So you won't mind if we take a look around?
Okay.
Keep an eye on her.
Yes, sir. Ma'am, not here for me.
We knew this was a brutal stabbing, so we're suspecting there will be blood evidence at the scene.
They walk in this house, and it's fairly obvious that a major party had taken place. Empty red cups, beer cans, liquor bottles.
And looking at Rose's kitchen, there were dirty dishes everywhere, but there was one thing that really stood out.
Does that look weird to you?
Yeah, a little bit.
As soon as we saw the knife, which really appeared out of place,
Let's get that thing bagged.
You got it.
we immediately thought this could be our murder weapon.
As they continue to search the house,
Check this out.
Anderson notices something alarming at the top of the basement staircase.
What's that look like to you?
That's blood.
Got that right.
We are on third base at this moment.
As we follow the blood evidence downstairs, we find a bloody shirt. We also saw a mop that appeared to be blood-stained.
There is smeared blood on the floor, as if the most incompetent user of a mop in the history of the world tried to clean up the floor for a few minutes.
Looks like we found our crime scene.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So Rose has a little more explaining to do about the source of all of this blood.
John, Call dispatch. Let them know we got to get this crime scene processed.
Yes, sir.
As for you, we need you to tell us exactly what happened here today.
Okay.
Rose isn't stupid. She knows why they're asking her.
We were throwing a graduation party for a family friend, and things just got crazy. I was out front. And next thing I know, Jim stumbled out of the house. Oh my God. Oh, Jim. Oh my God, Jim. What the hell happened?
Rose said she saw that Jim was hurt. He was struggling to get into his pickup truck.
Move. Okay, I'll drive. Go. Scoot. Move.
She knew he needed help immediately.
We got in the truck, and I was going to take him to the hospital. But when I saw the fire station, I just figured that they'd help him faster.
It is not unique for people to stop at a fire station with someone who's had a heart attack or a traumatic injury. That is not unusual. It happens. People shouldn't do that. If you try to go to a station thinking there are people there, they could be out on alarm. They could be training. They could have already transported someone to a hospital, and now you've delayed vital medical assistance for your loved one.
Why don't you stay with him at the fire station?
I didn't want to be involved.
Rose, you are involved in this. So your plan failed.
So how do you know Jim?
We haven't known each other long. I'm a painter, and we just met on a construction job a few months ago.
Were the two of you romantically involved?
No, nothing like that. Just friends.
As a matter of fact, Jim had confided in her that he still loved his wife and hoped they could work things out.
So you had nothing to do with Jim's death?
No, I swear to God, I wasn't involved.
At this point, we're thinking Rose probably is genuine.
They believe she's a witness and maybe isn't completely honest with them about what she knows about this, but they don't believe she's responsible.
So then who did kill Jim?
I don't know. Everybody loves him. Some of the people at the party, they've even done drywall for him before.
So you didn't see him at all?
I only remember seeing him in the kitchen. He was playing dominoes.
By himself?
No, he was playing with Armando.
Armando who?
Alvarez.
Mondo?
You know him?
Yeah, I know him. I've arrested him several times. Guy's in and out of prison. Real piece of work.
Detectives wonder if a drunken game of dominoes might have spurred a sudden explosion of violence.
What you gonna do, Mondo?
Shut up, Jim.
Ooh. Wrong move.
Damn it, Jim.
It's too easy.
You cheated.
I didn't do Mondo. Just relax.
Did the prison personality take over, and Armando decides that Mr. Seaman needs to meet his maker? Could that be possible? Oh, yes, it could. Violence in prison is instantaneous. It's flashpoint violence. There's an issue, you respond by attacking the other person. There's no discussion. It's immediate attack. It's the way things are done in a penitentiary. Mr. Alvarez has experience in these matters.
Gentlemen,
Hey, Joe. Long time no see.
so what do you guys got?
So we got a crime scene in the basement. Possible murder weapon is in the kitchen. We're gonna need this entire house processed.
Okay, what about her?
She's good.
As the sun begins to rise, Anderson is ready to give his new suspect, Armando Alvarez, a wake-up call.
What do you want?
When police get to Armando Alvarez's house, they're greeted by this short little angry woman who is not in any mood to have police at her house.
We're looking for Armando Alvarez.
My husband ain't here.
No? And where is he?
Not here. What, you want to talk to him?
That's Mondo.
Armando, freeze!
They see a shadow darting across the hallway, and they push past her to go get Armando, and she goes off.
So the situation did get rather crazy very quick.
She's absolutely out of control. These are the right kind of folks that we want to talk to about somebody being stabbed to death. Investigators are trying to determine who stabbed Jim Seaman to death at a graduation party. They're focused on an ex-convict, Armando Alvarez. When they approach him at his home, his wife immediately attacks an officer unprovoked.
Damn it!
I'll kill you!
Drop the shoe! Drop the shoe! Drop it! Get on the ground!
So now we're trying to control him. At the same time, we're arresting his wife.
She assaulted a police officer. Send her to central booking.
Stand by.
Listen, if you want to help her, you need to help us.
Armando is not happy about all of this. His wife has been removed, and she's going to jail for second-degree assault in a police house.
What happened yesterday?
I went to a graduation party for my nephew.
You were there with Jim Seaman?
Jim? No, I worked drywall with him, but I didn't see him at the party.
Oh, that's interesting. Because we were told that you were there playing dominoes together.
So unless you play dominoes wearing a blindfold, Armando, we're going to assume that you're lying through your teeth.
Look, there were a lot of people at the party, okay? Only whoever said that, or they got me confused with somebody else.
So you're saying you have no idea who stabbed Jim?
I didn't even know if Jim got stabbed. Probably I left before that even happened.
This is the typical response you get from people with a criminal past. Nobody ever knows anything.
Well, since you probably have nothing to hide, you don't mind if we take a look around, do you?
I guess. Take a look.
We're searching this house looking for bloody clothing, a knife, any other similar item that may connect him directly to this offense.
Got nothing.
We don't find anything of any evidentiary value. We know he's not telling the truth, but we don't have enough to arrest him.
So we're good?
No, not really. You might hear from us soon.
What about my wife?
Feel free to post a bell whenever you want.
After striking out with Armando, detectives rethink their approach.
Jim's wife, Mary, had told us that she knew of a minor altercation at work with a coworker. We know Armando did work for Jim, so it becomes important for us to get more information from the construction site.
Jim? Yeah, he's a top-notch guy. He's been doing drywall on my sites for a few years now. He and his crew always do good work.
At the construction site, we do talk to Ron Hopper, and he tells us that he hired Jim to be the foreman of the drywall crew.
How many guys were working for him on his most recent job?
There were 3 of them. Keno, Rufus, and Armando.
Know of any recent problems between Armando and Jim?
Between Jim and Armando? No, not that I can recall. But you know, there was a minor issue between Jim and Keno the other day.
Ron says the source of conflict between Keno and Jim was a paycheck.
Ron did remember an issue between Keno and Jim, where Jim had stopped by the construction site and picked up the paycheck for Keno, intending to deliver it to him. But when Keno arrived at the construction site and found out his paycheck wasn't there, he became upset.
Hey, Ron.
Hey, what's up, Keno?
Sure, about to grab my check.
Your check? Jim already grabbed it for you.
Wait, what? When?
Early this morning.
And you gave it to him?
Well, yeah. I mean, I figured you told him to swing by and grab it or something. And...
No way, I need that money now, man. I got people I gotta pay.
Well, I mean, Jim said he's going to another work site this afternoon. I'm sure you can find him there. And...
Man, I don't have time for this. Who the hell does Jim think he is?
Relax, Keno.
Dang.
Ran out of here all pissed off. And trust me, you don't want to be on Keno's bad side.
Why is that?
Guy can fly off the handle pretty easy.
Ron tells police that Keno has a very bad temper, especially when he's been drinking, and it can turn violent.
Wouldn't be surprised if he had words about it with Jim off-site.
What's Keno's last name?
Garcia.
Garcia. All right, we appreciate your time. Thank you.
So at this point, Keno emerges as a stronger suspect than Armando, because Keno has a motive. So now the question is, was Keno Garcia at that party?
In search of some answers, Detective Anderson circles back to Rose Trejo.
Excuse me.
Can I help you?
Hi. Detective Anderson with CSPD. I'm looking for Rose Trejo. She said she was staying here.
Man, she left already.
Do you know when she'll be back?
She didn't say.
Well, maybe you can help me then. Were you at your aunt's party yesterday?
Yeah, it was terrible.
She reports, "Oh, I was there, and I remember Jim Seaman covered in blood."
Did you see what happened?
No, I just saw him stumbling around. I freaked out. I just ran out there as quickly as I could.
Let me ask you something. Do you know who Keno Garcia is?
Keno? No, why?
Did you happen to see him at the party?
Yeah, I saw Keno right before that whole incident with Jim happened. I saw him going to the basement.
Really?
Wow. Not only does she put the man with a motive at the party, she puts him in close contact to the victim shortly before his injuries took place. That is important.
After Rose's niece drops this bombshell, Anderson sets out to learn more about their new prime suspect.
Hey, Anderson. I was over at Records, and Duffy asked if I could drop this off to you.
Is that the Garcia file?
Sure is.
Man, look at his record.
We do a background check, and we find that he is a convicted felon. He's been on parole, and he was last arrested for robbery and aggravated assault.
You think that might be your guy?
Very well might be.
So Keno, who is a convicted felon, who had a beef with our victim, who has a temper and drinks, is really adding up to be our #1 suspect.
This has all come together rather nicely, and Mr. Garcia has some explaining to do. So we've learned that Jim Seaman had a recent confrontation with one of his drywall workers, and this drywall worker is currently on parole from the state penitentiary. It's time to go speak to him and find out what he has to say about this.
Mr. Garcia, thank you for meeting with us.
Yeah, I'm used to it.
So tell us about your relationship with your colleague, Jim Seaman.
Jim was my homie. I can't believe what happened to him. It's terrible.
Keno tells police that Jim's a great guy to work with, and he doesn't really have any problems with him.
Well, if that's the case, then tell us what happened between you and him regarding your paycheck.
At the work site? No, man. That was nothing. Not a problem.
He explains that he blew that completely out of proportion. He said it was no big deal, that they've talked about it, it's behind them.
So you didn't have any words with Jim in the basement at Rose's party the other day?
No, man. We were good. And besides, I never even went in the basement.
Any ideas how Jim got stabbed?
I went outside before that even happened. When I came back, everyone was going nuts.
Right.
So he falls right in line with everybody else who had just left, just got there, or were in the bathroom when somebody was killing Jim Seaman.
Just got a small problem with that. Because someone told us that they saw you go downstairs just moments before Jim was stabbed.
What? Who told you that?
Well, someone we've been talking to. Someone who saw you.
I don't know. I had a lot to drink, you know?
We confront him that we do have an eyewitness that puts him downstairs, and he begins to backtrack.
So now you could have been in the basement.
I don't know. But if I was down there, I definitely didn't see what happened.
Well, if you're in the basement, then surely you saw something.
Garcia's face collapses, and he realizes his story is crumbling before his eyes. And then all of a sudden, he just drops his head and says,
"Look, I swear I didn't kill Jim, but I can't be no snitch, man."
A snitch is a person who speaks to authorities and tells the truth about their knowledge about someone else's criminal activity. In a penitentiary, they put a snitch jacket on you, is the expression, so that everybody knows that you are a person who will speak the truth to the authorities, that you disavow the code of silence, and you will come forward, and you will get murdered for that in a heartbeat in a jail.
So you're telling us that you know who killed Jim?
I'm saying I'm done talking.
Is he trying to protect someone who did this, or is he only trying to protect himself? Could be either one.
This is how it's going to be, Keno? Fine. Come on. You're free to go.
I am?
Yeah.
At this point, we decide to let Keno go. We don't think we have enough to hold him, and we certainly don't have enough to convict him.
I want a pair of eyes on him. I want to track his every move.
Good thinking. You got it.
Anderson wants to be in a better position with Keno Garcia and return to him when he has more leverage against him, either through other witnesses or other information he may be able to develop.
In the meantime, detectives continue to search for new information from Seaman's colleagues at work.
If they can find that person who has more loyalty to Mr. Seaman than they have to their associates, they may loosen this.
When we arrive, he's playing with his wife and kids in the front yard. He seems more stable than the other two.
So they go find the third member they haven't talked to in this drywall crew, and that's Rufus Medina.
Mr. Medina.
Yes?
I'm Detective Anderson with the Colorado Springs Police Department. I'd like to talk to you for a minute about Jim Seaman.
Jim? Yeah, of course. Hey, go play Mom for a little bit, okay?
Detective Anderson is thinking perhaps we've met someone who's loyal to Mr. Seaman. This guy looks like a genuine family man.
You know, it's just real awful what happened to Jim. Someone like him didn't deserve to die that way.
Well, that's why we're doing everything we can to figure out what happened to him. Were you at the party the other day?
I was, and to be honest, I had a few myself. I remember hearing some screaming, but that's about it.
So Rufus Medina all of a sudden becomes the same sort of I was there, but I didn't see anything guy that everybody else has been.
So what do you know about the issue with the paycheck between Jim and your coworker, Keno?
It's water under the bridge as far as I know.
You don't think Keno had it out for him?
Keno? No way. Keno would never do something like that.
He then says, if I knew who hurt him, I would tell you. And I have no idea who hurt Jim Seaman.
But you know what? If I hear anything, you'll be the first person to know, okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Rufus does come off somewhat credible. The problem is that everybody we've talked to deny knowing anything. This is one of those situations where everybody is lying.
The first thing you learn as a police detective is people do not respond out of a sense of duty. They don't respond to doing the right thing. They respond to pressure.
But where will that pressure come from? A few days later, Anderson finds his answer.
Anderson. Yeah, put her through. We got somebody on the line that's saying they know something about the Jim Seaman case.
Hello?
At this point in the investigation, we got an anonymous phone call from a woman who claimed to be at the party.
Did you see what happened to Jim Seaman?
No, but I saw him when he came up from the basement.
She saw Jim Seaman come up out of the basement, covered in blood, and he shouted, Rufus, you...
You heard Jim say that?
Yeah, he was shouting it. Then I looked down the basement steps, and that's when I saw him.
The anonymous caller said that she looked past Jim down the bottom of the stairs and saw Rufus. He was covered with blood, raging with anger.
Rufus Medina?
Yeah.
Rufus was really the last name that police thought they would hear.
We've finally stirred this nest enough to where there are enough hornets now that are buzzing. We're getting very close to who's responsible for this crime. All this time, we've been focusing on a couple of different people, and an anonymous phone tip has provided a new suspect, that Rufus Medina, Mr. I don't know who hurt Jim Seaman, is the guy who killed him.
But before zeroing in on Rufus, detectives hope to reap the rewards of an earlier strategy.
We decided we want to go back to Keno. It appears that he's violated his parole, so we think this pressure may bring him to tell us the truth.
Do you know why you're back here, Mr. Garcia?
No idea.
Keno, we understand you're in violation of your parole.
We've got you drinking and hanging around convicted felons.
Listen, Keno, you've got two options. I can either call your parole officer and have you sent back to the state pen in a heartbeat, or you can help us understand who killed Jim Seaman.
There's always a limit to your loyalty and always a limit to your willingness to continue with the code of silence. Parole violation is a serious limit.
Okay. All right. I was in the basement when Jim got stabbed. But I swear to God, it wasn't me.
Okay, tell us what happened.
We were all in the basement.
Who was?
Me, Rufus, Armando, and Jim.
Keno says they're talking to Seaman about work, and everybody's really drunk, and everybody's kind of a little angry.
We're all yelling back and forth. That's when I saw Rufus pull the knife.
He said all of a sudden, Rufus Medina attacks Seaman like a wild animal.
Keno says he tried to get the knife away, but it was too late. Jim had already been stabbed several times.
Then Jim took his shirt off and staggered up the steps. I couldn't believe it.
So you're telling us that Rufus stabbed him?
Mm-hmm.
How would Rufus do that?
I don't know, man.
He said, well, I was pretty drunk. I don't remember what was said just before Rufus went off, but Rufus went off.
Are we good now?
Not exactly. I have to hold you for the time being.
Officer?
What Keno Garcia is saying certainly matches well with the anonymous phone call, but they're going to need more than the accusation of a known criminal to get a conviction on Rufus Medina. They want a statement from Rufus. They want him to say what he did.
Before sitting down with Rufus Medina, detectives dig into his background and make some interesting discoveries.
We do find out that he, like his two buddies, is also on parole.
He's not the saint that they thought he might be. He has a violent background, and he's somebody that obviously could have done this.
Our society punishes people for committing criminal offenses by putting them in a penitentiary. Penitentiary is gladiator school. You learn how to behave even more violently and more badly than you did before you went in. The system, as it's designed, produces people who are not rehabilitated. They are often worsened by their experience. And Rufus Medina is a good example of that. So we bring in Rufus Medina. He remains very calm. He's an experienced criminal.
Guys, look, I'd love to help you, but I promise I was never down in that basement.
That's not what we were told.
I don't know where you guys are getting this stuff. Jim was my friend, and I would never hurt him.
He didn't know nothing about nothing. He didn't stab Jim Seaman. He doesn't know who did.
So is this how you want to play it? Fine. But mark my words. If I find out that you killed Jim Seaman, I'm going to put you away for it.
Although we probably had enough to arrest Rufus, we know our witnesses are not credible, and we do have a problem with some of the evidence. So we decide to not arrest him at that point.
Rufus, we don't forgive, and we don't forget. You should keep that in mind.
As the investigation continues into the summer, a familiar face is transferred back to homicide.
Hey, sir.
I had returned to homicide, and as a supervisor, I'm responsible for the actual closure of the case.
So where are we at with the Seaman case?
Nobody's story stays consistent. Everyone's telling something different. You know how it goes.
Okay. Right. You think it's time we start subpoenaing some of these people?
No point in wasting any more time.
All right.
We decided to impanel a grand jury. So we began serving subpoenas to the people at the party to induce them to come in and cooperate on the record with the risk of them being charged with a felony for perjury.
Every person who says they don't know anything, they better start remembering something. And if they don't remember the truth, they're going to suffer the consequence.
So over the next several days, several people are subpoenaed that were at the party. When they convene at the grand jury, all of them point to one person as being the suspect.
As a result of that pressure, they all testify, and one by one, they all name Rufus Medina as the person who killed Jim Seaman.
After that grand jury, we got a much better picture now of what happened at Rose's house.
Seaman comes to this party after he gets off work. The party is well attended, and everybody is juiced. They've been drinking all afternoon.
It's game. Man, this is too easy. Still can't believe he took my check like that. Oh, he didn't tell you anything about it? No, man, I didn't get that money right away, too.
They're still discussing that paycheck incident.
So first he takes our checks, and then he holds our money? Who does this guy think he is? I don't know.
And Rufus is getting more and more agitated that he needs to back up his man Keno.
Let's teach this gringo a lesson. Hey, Jim, Mondo, let's go downstairs. I want to show you guys something.
Sure thing, Migo.
Why you such Jim? The money, man. Why you messing with people's lives?
The paycheck, man!
Oh, Keno, I thought we already talked about this.
I needed that money right away, man.
Just because you run everything, you can just hold up money from us? I'm sorry, man. I was just trying to be helpful. I wasn't trying to screw you out of anything.
Jim tries to stop the argument, apologizes, but it was obvious that Rufus and Keno didn't want an apology. They wanted something else.
I'm a man, Holmes. And just relax, little kid. Whoa, whoa.
Don't you touch me, man. Hey, don't touch me. I know that you're pissed off, but don't put your hands on me, okay?
So Keno and Seaman get involved in a shoving match, but before punches start to be thrown,
You think you're better than us? You're done, man. You're done.
Dina just goes off into a wild, animalistic rage.
Stop!
He stabs him in the chest and he turns to get away from the blade. He stabs him in the back. So Seaman pulls his shirt off and staggers up the stairs.
You should have paid us, you piece. That's what you get. You should have gave us our money.
Jim staggers out to his truck. Rose helps him into the truck and drives him to the fire station.
You wonder what really happened in Rufus's mind to have him just react that way.
When Rufus is drinking, he doesn't need a lot of motivation. He just needs a target. The grand jury indicted Rufus Medina for 1 count of first-degree murder, and no charges were filed against anyone else who testified in front of the grand jury.
8 months later, Rufus Medina pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
Rufus Medina apologizes enormously. The judge thought he was sincere. He gave him a reduced sentence on second-degree murder of 16 years based on his remorse.
Jim Seaman did not deserve to die, especially under these circumstances. This was a gruesome death, and it was an avoidable death.
That's what's so sad about this, is that Jim was a good guy. He had hired these ex-criminals trying to help them get their life back on track. And here's how he's rewarded. And the fact that he was going around picking up paychecks for people, he was trying to do them a favor. But it appears that that one good deed is the thing that possibly led to his death.
Reality is a terrible thing because it's so real. Mr. Seaman dies over nothing. Mr. Medina goes back to prison over losing his temper. How could that make sense to anyone? It can't, because it doesn't make sense.
It starts with a sound no one remembers clearly anymore. A dull thud, a short scream, or maybe nothing at all. In the early hours of an October morning in 1991, New York City was already awake, but no one was listening. Taxis rolled past puddles reflecting neon lights. Steam rose from subway grates. Somewhere between the noise of the city and the silence of a locked apartment, a life ended, unnoticed, undocumented, and almost immediately forgotten. Years later, headlines would call it a cold case. Back then it was just another address, another call, another body behind a door that no one thought to knock on soon enough. The apartment sat on the 4th floor of a pre-war building in Queens, red brick darkened by decades of exhaust and rain. The hallway smelled of old carpet and boiled coffee. Neighbors would later say they heard arguments sometimes, muffled voices, nothing unusual for New York. No one reported screams. No one reported blood. When the superintendent finally unlocked the door after days of unanswered calls, the air inside was stale and heavy, the kind that tells you something has been wrong for a while. The victim lay on the bedroom floor, partially dressed, one arm bent unnaturally beneath the body. No sign of forced entry. No weapon in sight. A murder without witnesses, without urgency, without a clear beginning. Police arrived quickly but not carefully. This was 1991. New York was overwhelmed by violence. Homicide detectives were drowning in open files. A single dead adult in a locked apartment. No obvious robbery, no screaming neighbors. It didn't scream priority. Photos were taken. Notes were scribbled. Evidence was bagged with the efficiency of routine. A fingerprint was lifted from the inside of the bedroom door frame, smudged but visible, logged without ceremony, placed into a paper envelope and filed away. No match. No follow-up. Another line added to a growing list of maybes. The victim's name would appear briefly in the local paper, a short column buried between subway delays and weather reports. No photograph. No backstory. Just age, address, cause of death listed as homicide. Family members, scattered and distant, demanded answers at first, then learned the hard truth about New York justice in the early 90s. If your case didn't bleed into the street, it bled into paperwork instead. Weeks passed. Then months. Then years. Detectives were reassigned. Leads dried up. Witnesses forgot details. The fingerprint stayed where it was, yellowing slowly in a manila folder, waiting for a future no one imagined. What investigators didn't know was that this murder had already begun erasing itself. The crime scene had been compromised before the first officer arrived. Neighbors had walked through the hallway. The superintendent had touched the door handle. The body had been discovered too late to preserve fragile clues. And the city itself, loud and relentless, swallowed context. In a place where millions move past each other every day, anonymity is not suspicious, it's normal. Whoever killed that person understood that. Or maybe they just got lucky. The early investigation chased shadows. A former partner was questioned, then cleared. A co-worker was interviewed, nervous but cooperative. Phone records were thin. Bank accounts showed nothing unusual. There was no dramatic suspect, no explosive motive. No blood trail leading down the stairs. Just a closed door and unanswered questions. Detectives labeled it unsolved, not because they had tried everything, but because there was nothing obvious left to try. The file was boxed, shelved, and forgotten, buried among hundreds of others marked cold case. A phrase that sounds clinical but really means time has won. Outside, the neighborhood changed. Old tenants moved out. New families moved in. The building was repainted. The hallway carpet was replaced. The city kept moving forward, but the room where the murder happened stayed frozen in memory, replayed only in the minds of those who once cared. For them, time didn't heal. It stretched the mystery thin, turning anger into quiet dread. Someone somewhere knew what happened. Someone had walked away, and no one was coming to stop them. Years later, technology would advance. Databases would grow. Fingerprints would be scanned instead of stored. Computers would remember what humans forgot. But in 1991, that future felt distant and irrelevant. Back then, the system depended on instinct, manpower, and luck. And this case had none of it. The fingerprint, the only silent witness left behind, waited in darkness, its ridges holding a truth that couldn't yet be heard. And so the murder slipped into history without ceremony. No press conference. No arrest. No closure. Just a name fading from memory, an apartment re-rented, and a city that never noticed the absence. The cold case didn't begin with a mystery. It began with indifference. And that indifference would protect the truth for decades. Somewhere in a filing room, under fluorescent lights that hummed without emotion, the envelope rested untouched. Inside it, a single forgotten fingerprint, pressed against paper, patient, persistent, unchanged by time, waiting for the moment when the past would collide with the present, and when a murder New York thought it had buried would refuse to stay silent any longer. By the winter of 1992, the case had already begun to decay. Not officially, not on paper, but in the way voices soften when they repeat the same questions too many times, in the way detectives stop expecting answers and start expecting silence. The precinct still carried the file, still listed the homicide as active, but the truth was visible in the margins. Fewer notes, longer gaps, dates without substance. The city was burning then, crime statistics climbing like a fever, and this murder had failed to compete for attention. It had no spectacle, no chase, no headline that demanded urgency. It simply existed, unresolved, quietly slipping backward in priority as newer horrors arrived. Detectives revisited the apartment once, months later, walking through rooms now stripped of personal belongings, repainted, deodorized. The air felt clean in a way that was almost offensive. Whatever violence had happened there had left no stain the eye could catch anymore. They stood in the bedroom, staring at the spot where the body had been found, trying to reconstruct chaos from emptiness. A struggle? Possibly. An argument? Likely. But nothing spoke clearly. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Just a room that gave nothing back. They returned to the people who had known the victim best, hoping time might loosen tongues. Family members offered fragments, memories sharpened by grief but dulled by distance. There were mentions of stress, of unease, of someone who seemed distracted in the weeks before the death. A sense of being watched, or followed, or maybe just overwhelmed. The problem with memory is that it reshapes itself to fit the ending. Every strange moment becomes suspicious in hindsight. Every disagreement becomes a potential motive. Investigators listened, nodded, wrote things down, knowing most of it would never be verifiable. Neighbors were questioned again. The answers were predictable. Yes, there were arguments sometimes. Yes, voices raised late at night. No, they couldn't identify anyone specific. New York apartments teach people to ignore sounds that don't involve them. Survival depends on it. A scream could be a television. A thud could be furniture. Silence could mean nothing at all. No one wanted to be the person who misread the noise and wasted police time. No one wanted to be responsible. And so no one remembered enough. There was a man mentioned early in the case, an acquaintance whose name surfaced more than once. He had been seen near the building weeks before the murder. He had reasons to be upset. Reasons vague enough to sound ominous when spoken aloud. Detectives brought him in. He sat across the table, calm, almost bored, answering questions with practiced ease. His alibi wasn't perfect, but it wasn't broken either. No physical evidence tied him to the scene. No witness placed him inside the apartment that night. Suspicion alone wasn't enough, and in 1991, suspicion without proof was a luxury investigators couldn't afford to indulge for long. Another angle focused on the idea of a stranger. No forced entry didn't mean no intrusion. Doors could be opened willingly. Trust could be misplaced. The city was full of people who passed through lives briefly, leaving no trace strong enough to hold. A delivery. A visit. A conversation that turned violent. It fit the randomness of the crime, but randomness is impossible to investigate. You can't chase a face you've never seen. You can't interrogate absence. Evidence was reviewed again. The fingerprint resurfaced briefly, lifted carefully from its envelope, studied under better light. It was partial but clear enough to identify ridges, whorls, a unique pattern that belonged to someone. Someone real. It had been run through local databases at the time, but databases were small then, fragmented, incomplete. If the person had never been arrested in New York, the system would never know them. The print came back empty. No hit. No identity. Another dead end. The medical examiner's report offered no dramatic revelation. Cause of death confirmed homicide. Time of death estimated within a broad window that swallowed the night whole. No foreign DNA recovered. No defensive wounds that could point clearly to the size or strength of the attacker. The body told a story, but only in a language investigators had already heard too many times before. Violent. Sudden. Unexplained. As months turned into a year, the case stopped moving forward and began circling itself. Detectives reread old notes, chasing details that had once seemed insignificant. A comment about a late-night phone call. A neighbor mentioning footsteps on the stairs. A memory of someone knocking on the wrong door. None of it could be confirmed. None of it could be disproven. It was the kind of investigation that exhausts rather than progresses, where effort doesn't equal momentum. Then the file was reassigned. And reassigned again. Each time, the new detective approached it with fresh eyes and the same sinking realization. Everything actionable had already been done. Every witness had been questioned. Every lead had gone cold. The city had changed around the case, but the case itself remained frozen in time, untouched by resolution. By the mid-90s, the word cold began appearing more frequently in internal discussions. Not officially stamped, not declared with ceremony, but understood. Cold case. A phrase that sounds passive, almost gentle, but carries the weight of failure. It meant the investigation would stay open in theory, but dormant in practice. It meant waiting for something external. A confession, a mistake, a coincidence powerful enough to break decades of silence. The fingerprint returned to its envelope. The envelope returned to its box. The box returned to storage. In that darkness, surrounded by thousands of others just like it, The case settled into obscurity. New York moved on. New crimes demanded attention. New victims filled headlines. This one faded into the background noise of a city that never stops producing tragedy. For the family, the passage of time was cruel. Anniversaries passed without answers. Birthdays arrived carrying absence instead of celebration. They called occasionally, asking if anything had changed, if there were any updates. The answers were always the same. No new leads. No developments. Still investigating. Words that sounded reassuring but meant nothing. And somewhere out there, the person responsible kept living, working, aging, blending into crowds. They carried no visible mark of what they had done, no scar that the city could recognize. They benefited from the same anonymity that swallowed the case itself. In a city of millions, a single unsolved murder is easy to outrun. All you have to do is keep walking. By the time the case officially earned its cold case label, nearly a decade had passed. Evidence standards had changed. Technology had evolved. But the file remained anchored to 1991. Locked into the limitations of its time. The forgotten fingerprint stayed silent, its potential unrealized, its testimony delayed by a world that wasn't ready to listen. The murder had become a ghost, present in records, absent in reality. A question without an answer. A door that had been closed for so long no one remembered what it felt like to knock. And yet, beneath layers of dust and years of neglect, the truth remained intact, waiting for the moment when time itself would turn against the person who thought they had gotten away clean. Because cold cases don't disappear. They sleep. And when they wake, they do so without warning. Time has a way of rearranging truth. By the late 90s, the murder no longer lived in conversations or case briefings. It lived in storage. A cardboard box stamped with a number few people bothered to memorize. Inside it, reports typed on aging machines, photographs slowly losing contrast, evidence bags sealed with tape that had begun to yellow. The case wasn't dead. It was preserved like something frozen too quickly, its details intact but inaccessible. And in the background, New York itself was changing, shedding one skin after another, becoming safer, cleaner, quieter. A city less willing to remember how violent it once was. Inside the precinct, cold cases were spoken about in lowered voices, usually as cautionary tales. Stories of missed chances. Of witnesses who died. Of suspects who vanished. This one rarely came up. It didn't have a nickname. It didn't have a face people recognized. It was just another unresolved homicide from the bad old days, filed under the assumption that whatever answers it held were probably gone for good. The detectives who had first worked it retired, transferred, or passed away. Institutional memory evaporated. What remained were documents stripped of tone, stripped of urgency, stripped of the fear that had once filled that apartment. And yet, something subtle was happening beneath the surface. Technology was beginning to creep into law enforcement, quietly, imperfectly. Fingerprint databases expanded. Systems that once spoke different languages started learning how to communicate. Prints that had once been trapped within city limits could now be compared nationally. At first, it was clumsy, slow, but it introduced a dangerous idea, that nothing truly forgotten was beyond reach anymore. The fingerprint from the bedroom door frame was still there. It had survived relocations, audits, reorganizations. No one threw it out because no one dared take responsibility for erasing evidence, even evidence that seemed useless. It existed in limbo, not important enough to revisit, not unimportant enough to destroy. Every so often during a routine inventory, someone would pause, glance at it, then move on. The system wasn't ready for it yet. Meanwhile, the world moved forward, and so did the unknown person behind that print. Whoever they were, they aged. They adapted. They lived in an era that increasingly recorded everything. Employment records, housing applications, fingerprints taken for jobs, for licenses, for minor offenses. Each year that passed quietly tightened the net, though no one noticed. The killer didn't need to run. They just needed to exist long enough for their own past to catch up. In the early 2000s, a new generation of detectives entered the force. Younger. More technical. Less shaped by the chaos of the crack era. They looked at cold cases differently. Not as failures, but as puzzles delayed by circumstance. Some began volunteering for cold case units. Drawn by the strange intimacy of crimes untouched by time, they reopened boxes, reread reports, asked questions their predecessors hadn't bothered with. This case, still nameless, still faceless, began to breathe again. A detective assigned to review dormant homicides pulled the file one afternoon, almost at random. The details were familiar in their ordinariness. Locked apartment, no forced entry, no witnesses, no resolution. But something lingered. The fingerprint. Logged. Lifted cleanly enough to matter. Never matched. Never rerun. It was the kind of detail that once meant nothing and now meant everything. The detective flagged it, not with excitement, but with curiosity. A quiet note in the margin. Worth another look. But progress was slow. Resources were limited. Cold cases competed with active investigations for attention and funding. Every step required justification. Paperwork. Approvals. Time. The fingerprint couldn't simply be scanned and solved overnight. Evidence needed to be verified, preserved, prepared. Chain of custody confirmed. The process itself became a test of patience, echoing the patience the case had already demanded for more than a decade. While the system hesitated, the story continued to distort in memory. Family members aged. Some passed away without answers. Those who remained learned to live with a version of the past that had no conclusion. They told the story less often. Pain dulls when it has nowhere to go. The community around the old apartment barely remembered the incident at all. New tenants had no idea what had happened within those walls. To them, it was just another New York unit with thin walls and unreliable plumbing. Then, quietly, without headlines or ceremony, the fingerprint was digitized. It wasn't dramatic. No alarm sounded. No sudden realization. Just a technician scanning an old print into a newer system, converting ridges into data, data into possibility. The image appeared on a screen, cleaner than it had ever been on paper. For the first time since 1991, the fingerprint was visible in a language modern systems could understand. It entered a database far larger than the one that had rejected it years before. And then it waited again. Days passed. Then weeks. No immediate match. No instant miracle. The detective wasn't surprised. Cold cases teach restraint. Hope is a liability if you let it move too fast. But something had shifted. The fingerprint was no longer buried. It was active. Alive. Searching. At the same time, a different investigation, unrelated and routine, unfolded elsewhere. A minor arrest. A background check. Fingerprints taken as a matter of procedure. Another set of ridges added to the system. At the moment those prints were uploaded, no one thought about Queens in 1991. No one connected the dots consciously. The computer did that instead. It happened without warning. A notification. A potential match flagged among thousands. Not definitive. Not confirmed. But close enough to demand attention. The kind of alert that makes a detective stop what they're doing and read twice. The fingerprint from the cold case had found something familiar. Or rather, someone. The name attached to the match wasn't famous. It didn't carry weight. It belonged to a person who had lived quietly, mostly unnoticed, for years. The kind of person who blends into the city without effort. But the match was strong enough to reopen questions that had been dormant for decades. Strong enough to drag the past into the present. The detective stared at the screen, aware of the gravity but careful not to rush it. Matches can be wrong. Systems can err. Lives can be destroyed by assumptions. Every step now had to be precise. Verified. Confirmed. The cold case wasn't solved yet. But for the first time since the body was found on that bedroom floor, it had direction. Somewhere in New York, a person who believed the city had forgotten them entirely continued their day, unaware that a small decision made years earlier, a touch against a door frame, a careless moment, had finally begun to speak. The fingerprint, patient through decades of silence, had remembered what everyone else had tried to forget. And it was not done talking. The notification didn't feel real at first. It sat there on the screen, quiet, clinical, stripped of drama. A potential match. Probable. High confidence. The kind of language designed to restrain emotion, to prevent premature conclusions. But for the detective reading it, the words landed heavy. This was the sound of a door unlocking after decades. Not opening yet, just unlocking. What came next would decide whether the past stayed buried or tore itself back into the present. Procedure took over. The detective printed the report, reviewed the parameters, checked the source. The fingerprint from 1991 had been compared against a newer entry, collected during a routine arrest years later for an offense unrelated to violence. No headlines. No mugshot anyone would recognize. Just a name, an age, an address history that stretched across boroughs and years. A life lived mostly beneath notice. The system wasn't claiming certainty yet. It was asking for human judgment. The first step was verification. Old evidence has a way of betraying you if you rush it. The original fingerprint was retrieved again, this time with care bordering on reverence. It had survived moves, audits, budget cuts, indifference. Now it lay under modern light, magnified, enhanced. Analysts compared ridge by ridge, point by point. The process was slow, meticulous, unforgiving. No intuition allowed. Only math. Only pattern. While that work unfolded, the detective began reconstructing the life behind the potential match. Employment records showed nothing extraordinary. Short-term jobs. Long gaps. Addresses that changed just often enough to avoid pattern. No stable anchor. No clear narrative. Criminal history was thin. Minor offenses. Nothing violent. Nothing that would have put this person on a homicide unit's radar. In the early 90s, they would have been invisible. Exactly the kind of person a city like New York forgets to watch. But there were coincidences. In 1991, the individual had lived within reasonable distance of the victim's apartment. Not next door. Not across the street. But close enough that proximity could no longer be dismissed. They had known people who moved in the same social orbit. Not closely. Not obviously. Just enough overlap to make the air feel heavier. Cold cases live on that edge, where coincidence and intent blur. The lab confirmation came days later. The match held. The fingerprint from the bedroom door frame and the print in the database belonged to the same person. The conclusion wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its simplicity. After decades of silence, the evidence had finally spoken clearly. The cold case was no longer anonymous. It had a direction. It had a human shape. Still no one said solved. Not yet. A fingerprint places a person at a location, not at a moment. It proves presence, not guilt. Defense attorneys dismantle cases built on less. The detective knew the burden ahead would be heavy. Time had eroded memories. Witnesses had vanished. Physical evidence was limited. Everything would hinge on how carefully the next steps were taken. Surveillance began quietly. Nothing intrusive. Just observation. The suspect was older now, slower, less guarded. They lived an unremarkable life, one that blended seamlessly into the background of the city. Watching them didn't feel like watching a monster. That was the unsettling part. There was no visible weight of guilt. No obvious fear. Just routine. Work. Home. Repetition. The kind of normalcy that makes unresolved murders harder to accept. Investigators revisited the victim's story with new eyes. Old interviews were reread. Minor details took on new meaning. A passing mention of someone who helped out sometimes. A name half remembered, dismissed years earlier because it led nowhere. That name matched the suspect's circle. Not directly, but close enough that the dismissal now felt premature. The past began to rearrange itself, aligning slowly, reluctantly. The detective contacted surviving family members. Carefully. You don't tell people their nightmare might finally be ending without preparing them for the possibility that it still might not. Hope is fragile when it's been starved for decades. The family listened in silence, absorbing words they had waited years to hear and feared hearing at the same time. A suspect. A fingerprint. Progress. None of it sounded real. All of it felt dangerous. Meanwhile, prosecutors were briefed. Their reaction was measured, cautious. They had seen cold cases collapse under scrutiny before. They asked hard questions. Where is the rest of the evidence? Can you place him there at the time of death? Why did it take so long? Each question wasn't skepticism, it was survival. A bad case doesn't just fail, It poisons the system. Investigators began searching for corroboration. Old phone records were requested, though many had been purged. Employment logs were tracked down, some incomplete, some missing. The suspects' whereabouts on the night of the murder were unclear, conveniently so. They had no solid alibi. No one remembered them being anywhere specific. Time had granted them a kind of accidental immunity. Then came the interview request. It wasn't framed as an accusation, just a conversation, a chance to clear things up. The suspect agreed without hesitation. That alone raised quiet alarms. Innocent people hesitate. Guilty people sometimes don't. They believe the past is too distant to matter. They trust the erosion of time. In the interrogation room, decades collapsed into minutes. The suspect looked older than their records suggested. Lines etched deep. Hands steady. Voice calm. When asked about 1991, they paused, not because they were confused, but because they were choosing their words carefully. Memory is selective, especially when it has rehearsed its own version of events for years. They denied knowing the victim well, claimed to have visited the apartment once or twice, nothing memorable. When the fingerprint was mentioned, not yet revealed as evidence, their body reacted before their mouth did. A slight stiffening. A blink held too long. The detective noticed. Noted it. Said nothing. No confession came that day. No dramatic collapse. Just small fractures. Inconsistencies that wouldn't have mattered years ago, but now stood out sharply against the weight of the fingerprint. The suspect left the room believing they had survived another encounter with authority. They didn't realize the rules had changed. Outside the room, the detective exhaled for the first time in hours. This was the moment cold cases pivot on. The fragile space between suspicion and proof. The fingerprint had opened the door, but the room beyond it was still dark. Everything now depended on patience, precision, and the willingness to confront a past that refused to stay buried. Somewhere between 1991 and now, a murder that had once disappeared into the noise of New York had found its voice again. It wasn't shouting yet. It was whispering. But the whisper was steady, relentless, and it was getting closer to being heard by everyone. The days after the interview stretched thin, taut with anticipation. Nothing moved publicly, but everything shifted behind closed doors. The suspect returned to their routine, unaware that it was no longer invisible. Investigators reconstructed timelines with the patience of archivists, combing through fragments the way you search debris after a collapse, hoping something recognizable remains. Old calendars, pay stubs, transit records that barely existed anymore. Every scrap was weighed, not for what it proved, but for what it quietly contradicted. The fingerprint had changed the gravity of the case. It pulled everything toward it. Suddenly, details once dismissed as noise began to orbit a single point. The unlocked door. The absence of forced entry. The idea that the victim had known their killer, at least enough to let them inside. Investigators replayed the night again and again, imagining the approach, the knock, the hesitation, the decision to open the door. Violence that doesn't break in usually arrives invited. They went back to the building. Not the apartment. That had changed too much. But the stairwell, the lobby, the space between floors where sound travels unpredictably. They listened to echoes, tested footsteps, measured how voices carried. A raised argument could dissolve into nothing by the time it reached another door. A struggle could sound like furniture shifting. The city teaches people to rationalize danger away. That realization no longer felt like a failure of witnesses. It felt like a feature of the crime. Investigators tracked down anyone still alive who had crossed paths with the suspect in the early 90s. Former co-workers, old acquaintances, people who barely remembered each other, but remembered the feeling someone left behind. These interviews were different from the first wave decades earlier. Time had stripped away loyalty. Relationships had dissolved. People spoke more freely now, less worried about consequences, more aware of their own mortality. And patterns emerged. The suspect had a temper. Not explosive, but simmering. Controlled until it wasn't. They had conflicts that escalated quietly, leaving no witnesses, no scenes. Arguments that ended with people cutting ties rather than calling police. This wasn't a portrait of a monster. It was a portrait of risk, the kind that rarely draws attention until it's too late. One former acquaintance remembered the suspect disappearing briefly around the time of the murder. Not long, just enough to raise questions in hindsight. Another recalled them speaking bitterly about betrayal, about being used, about people who didn't know what they were risking. None of it was evidence on its own. Together, it formed a low, constant hum beneath the case, a tone that hadn't been audible before. Prosecutors pressed for more. A fingerprint alone wouldn't survive trial without context. They needed to place the suspect in the apartment at the right time, with the right state of mind. Investigators returned to the medical examiner's report, looking past conclusions and into raw observations. The nature of the injuries, the angle, the force. Not enough to profile a stranger, but enough to suggest familiarity. This wasn't random violence. It was personal, contained, executed without spectacle. The suspect was interviewed again. This time the tone shifted. Still calm, still measured. But the questions were sharper, anchored by facts instead of hypotheticals. Dates, locations, names. The suspect's memory faltered in places it had been confident before. Details blurred. Timelines shifted subtly. Small changes, but consistent ones. The kind of inconsistencies that don't prove guilt but erode credibility grain by grain. Then came the moment the fingerprint was revealed. The detective didn't dramatize it, just stated it plainly. A print recovered from the bedroom door frame matched the suspect's. The room changed instantly. Breath caught. Posture tightened. Silence stretched longer than it needed to. When the suspect spoke again, the explanation arrived too quickly, rehearsed and brittle. They had visited the apartment before. Touched the door. Nothing unusual. Innocent contact. A coincidence amplified by time. Coincidence is a fragile defense. It cracks under repetition. Investigators didn't push for a confession. Not yet. Cold cases reward restraint. They let pressure build naturally, fed by the weight of inevitability. The suspect left the room shaken, no longer protected by anonymity. For the first time, the past had a shape they could see approaching. Behind the scenes, the case tightened. Prosecutors began drafting theories, testing them against the evidence. Weak points were identified, reinforced, or abandoned. Everything that couldn't be supported was cut away. This wasn't about telling a story. It was about surviving scrutiny. The city had learned painfully how quickly a celebrated cold case could unravel if rushed. The family was informed again. This time the update carried weight. Not promises. Just progress that felt real. The knowledge was both relief and burden. Answers, if they came, would reopen wounds long scarred over. Closure is never as clean as people imagine. It arrives heavy, complicated, late. As investigators prepared their next move, the suspect began to change behavior. Subtle things. Missed appointments. Nervous energy. A life that had once flowed quietly now showed signs of turbulence. Guilt doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like vigilance. Like someone who knows the walls are closing in but can't see where the door is. The city outside remained indifferent. Trains ran. Sirens echoed. New crimes claimed attention. But beneath the surface, an old murder was moving again, dragging with it decades of silence. The fingerprint had done its job. It had remembered. And now it had forced everyone else to remember too. What remained was the hardest part. Transforming memory into proof, suspicion into truth, and a cold case into something the justice system could finally confront without flinching. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it seeps in, slow and deliberate, until every breath feels measured. After the fingerprint reveal, the case entered that phase. Nothing exploded outward, but everything collapsed inward. Investigators stopped asking whether the suspect could be responsible, and focused instead on how the truth might finally surface after hiding in plain sight for so long. They rebuilt the final days of the victim's life hour by hour, not as a timeline but as a mood. Who they spoke to, where they went, how they sounded. A co-worker remembered them being distracted, jumpy, checking the hallway more than usual. A neighbor recalled seeing them pause before unlocking the door one evening, as if listening for something behind them. At the time it meant nothing. Now it suggested anticipation. Or fear. The suspect's name appeared again, not loudly, not cleanly, but persistently. A casual visit. An unresolved disagreement. A debt, emotional or otherwise, that never made it into reports because no one thought to ask the right question then. Investigators learned the two had argued weeks before the murder. Not violently. Just enough to sour the air. Just enough to linger. In a city where conflicts dissolve quickly, unresolved tension can be more dangerous than open hostility. Financial records added another layer. Not motive in the cinematic sense, but pressure. Instability. The suspect had been struggling at the time, moving between jobs, borrowing money, leaning on people who were beginning to pull away. The victim had been one of them. Support can turn into resentment when it feels conditional. Dependence can rot into anger when it's threatened. No one says these things out loud, but they leave marks. Investigators requested another interview. This time the suspect hesitated. Not refusal. Just delay. A request to reschedule. A question about whether a lawyer would be necessary. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Confidence had given way to calculation. The past was no longer distant enough to feel safe. During the interview, the suspect spoke less. Answered narrowly. When confronted with new witness recollections, they dismissed them as misunderstandings, exaggerations born of time. When asked to explain inconsistencies in their earlier statements, they leaned on memory loss. It was believable. It was also convenient. Time erodes everyone's recollection, except when it doesn't. Investigators noticed something else. The suspect avoided specifics when discussing the apartment layout, despite claiming to have visited multiple times. They couldn't describe the bedroom clearly. They stumbled over the position of doors, the direction of the hallway. Details people usually remember unconsciously. The detective didn't interrupt. Let the gaps speak for themselves. Outside the room, the case tightened further. Prosecutors approved a limited search warrant. Not for the past, that was gone, but for connections. Old letters. Photographs. Anything that could establish depth of relationship. The search didn't uncover a smoking gun. It uncovered proximity. Evidence of familiarity that contradicted the suspect's claims of casual contact. The lie wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. Then came the emotional fracture. In a quiet moment during questioning, the detective mentioned the victim's family. Not as leverage. Just as fact. Decades without answers. Parents who had died waiting. Siblings who had stopped asking questions because asking hurt too much. The suspect looked away. Their jaw tightened. The room filled with something heavier than fear, recognition. Not of guilt confessed, but of consequence acknowledged. Still no confession. Cold cases rarely deliver them cleanly. People who have lived with a secret for decades don't surrender it easily. They've had too much time to justify it, to narrate it privately until it feels less like a crime and more like an inevitability. Investigators pivoted. If the truth wouldn't come directly, it would be boxed in. They re-examined the physical dynamics of the murder. The absence of forced entry. The lack of defensive wounds. The contained violence. Experts weighed in, careful with language but firm in implication. This was not a stranger's act. This was someone the victim trusted, at least for a moment. The suspect was placed at the apartment through the fingerprint. Their relationship was established through witnesses and records. Their emotional state was contextualized through financial and personal stress. Individually, each piece was fragile. Together, they formed a structure strong enough to stand. The city's legal machinery began to hum. Quiet meetings. Draft affidavits. Long nights reviewing transcripts. Every sentence was sharpened, tested, stripped of speculation. Cold cases don't get second chances. If this moved forward, it had to move forward clean. The family was called again. This time the tone changed. Not hopeful. Certain. An arrest was possible. Not guaranteed. But close. The words landed differently now. They didn't bring relief. They brought gravity. Justice delayed doesn't arrive lightly. It carries the weight of everything it failed to prevent. And the suspect felt it. Friends noticed withdrawal. A life once structured around routine began to unravel at the edges. They asked about the past more often, about what investigators could prove, about whether fingerprints really last forever. Questions that revealed more than any answer could. Because the truth about cold cases is this: they don't wait for the guilty to be ready. They wait for the moment when the past becomes unavoidable, when technology catches up, when people talk, when silence stops being enough. And that moment was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The warrant was signed on a gray morning that felt heavier than it should have. No cameras, no sirens, just ink pressed into paper, transforming years of suspicion into legal authority. For investigators, this was the line, the point where theory surrendered to action. Once crossed, there would be no quiet retreat, no folding the file back into storage. The past was about to be named out loud. They moved carefully, deliberately. The arrest was planned for a moment that would draw no attention. A place where resistance was unlikely and witnesses unnecessary. When it happened, it felt almost unreal. No chase. No shouting. Just a hand on an arm, a voice stating facts, rights recited with practiced neutrality. The suspect didn't struggle. They didn't ask why. They already knew. At the precinct, time seemed to compress. Decades of silence collapsed into fluorescent-lit corridors, and the faint hum of ventilation. The suspect sat alone, older now than the person who had left that fingerprint behind, but tethered to that moment all the same. Investigators watched through glass, aware of the irony, that the city which once ignored this death was now holding its breath over it. Charges were read slowly. Murder. The word landed with weight, even after all these years. The suspect's expression didn't change much, but something behind the eyes did. Denial had been a strategy for a long time. Now it was a reflex, weaker than before. They asked about evidence, about fingerprints, about what could really be proven after so long. Questions shaped by fear, not innocence. Interrogation followed protocol, but emotion crept in through the cracks. Investigators laid out the case not as an accusation, but as a sequence: presence, relationship, opportunity, silence. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten. They let the evidence speak, knowing that facts endure longer than pressure ever could. The suspect clung to distance, claimed memory gaps, suggested coincidence. But the story was thinner now. When asked directly about the night of the murder, they paused longer than before. Long enough for the room to feel tight. Long enough for the weight of years to press down. They answered eventually, but the response was hollow, stripped of detail, rehearsed beyond usefulness. No confession came. None was expected. Cold cases rarely deliver that kind of closure. What they deliver instead is inevitability. The slow realization that the past has become a courtroom, and every choice made afterward will be judged against it. News of the arrest spread quietly at first. A short bulletin. A few lines in local outlets. No sensational headlines. No reenactments. But for those who remembered the case, the family, the detectives, the few who had once cared, it felt seismic. A name had finally been attached to the crime. The city had finally acknowledged the absence it once ignored. The family was notified before the story broke. The call was brief, respectful, final in a way previous updates had never been. An arrest. Charges filed. Court proceedings to follow. Silence filled the space after the words were spoken. Not relief. Not celebration. Just the slow intake of breath after holding it for decades. In court, the suspect appeared diminished. Time had not been kind. The defense leaned heavily on delay, on lost evidence, on faded memories. They questioned the reliability of old fingerprints, the fairness of resurrecting a life-altering accusation after so many years. It was a strategy as old as cold cases themselves. Argue that time itself is the defendant. Prosecutors countered with restraint. They didn't dramatize. They didn't embellish. They presented the fingerprint, the relationship, the lies, the silence. They let the jury see the case not as a relic, but as a truth postponed. Justice delayed is not justice denied, they argued. It is justice waiting for the tools to arrive. As the trial loomed, investigators revisited the apartment one last time. Not for evidence, but for closure of their own. The building looked different now. Renovated. Quiet. But standing in the hallway, the echo of that night felt close again. The city forgets quickly. Walls don't. The suspects sat in a holding cell, facing a future that had narrowed abruptly. For years, they had lived under the illusion that time was protection, that anonymity was immunity, that New York, vast and indifferent, would never look back. They were wrong. Time hadn't erased the crime. It had preserved it. Outside, the city continued, unaware of the reckoning unfolding within its systems. People hurried past, phones glowing, lives intersecting briefly before separating again. Somewhere among them were countless stories that would never be told. This one finally would be. Because cold cases don't end when the evidence is found. They end when silence breaks. When a name is spoken. When the city that once looked away is forced, at last, to look directly at what it left behind. And the trial had not yet begun. The courtroom was smaller than people expected. No grandeur. No cinematic scale. Just wood, fluorescent light, and the quiet friction of bodies shifting in their seats. This was where the past would be measured, not by memory or rumor, but by rules. Time, which had protected the accused for decades, was now the first thing placed on trial. Jury selection moved slowly. Faces were scanned for bias, for impatience, for the subtle tells of people who had already decided what they believed about old crimes resurfacing. Some jurors were excused the moment they heard the words cold case. Others leaned forward, curious, pulled by the gravity of a mystery that had refused to die. 12 remained. Ordinary people asked to carry extraordinary weight. Opening statements avoided drama. Prosecutors spoke plainly. A murder in 1991. An apartment in Queens. A fingerprint left behind and forgotten. A system not yet capable of hearing what that evidence had to say. Then technology caught up. The truth resurfaced. The story wasn't framed as redemption. It was framed as responsibility. Evidence doesn't age, they said. Only our ability to read it does. The defense responded with equal restraint. They spoke of delay, of faded memories, of the danger of convicting someone based on fragments recovered long after context had been erased. They didn't deny the fingerprint outright. They questioned its meaning. Presence, they argued, is not guilt. Time blurs everything. Reasonable doubt thrives in gaps. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Detectives testified first, walking the jury through the original investigation, its limits, its failures. There was no attempt to hide them. The city in 1991 had been overwhelmed. Resources stretched thin. Priorities skewed by crisis. The admission felt risky, but honest. The case hadn't gone cold because no one cared. It had gone cold because the system couldn't carry everything at once. Forensic experts followed. They explained fingerprints with careful precision, translating science into language jurors could grasp. How ridges form. How patterns persist. How probability narrows until coincidence collapses. Enlarged images were displayed, old and new. The same lines echoing across decades. The room leaned in. This was the spine of the case. If it held, everything else could stand. Cross-examination pushed hard. Could the print have been transferred earlier? Could contamination have occurred? Could technology be wrong? The expert answered without defensiveness. Possibility exists in theory, they said. Probability tells a different story. The match was not casual. It was precise. Time had not altered it, only revealed it. Then came the witnesses from the past. Former acquaintances. Old co-workers. People who hadn't thought about 1991 in years, until a detective's call forced memory awake. Their testimonies were imperfect. Hesitant. Honest about what they didn't remember. But patterns emerged anyway. Tension. Arguments. A relationship closer than the defense had admitted. Not explosive. Not theatrical. Just unstable enough to matter. The victim's family took the stand last. Not to argue evidence, but to give the absence a shape. They spoke quietly, carefully, of unanswered phones, of holidays passed with an empty chair, of years spent wondering whether justice had simply decided not to show up. There were no accusations in their voices, just fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying uncertainty too long. The defendant listened without reaction. Hands folded. Eyes forward. Years of restraint held in place. But something shifted when the fingerprint was mentioned again, enlarged on the screen, unmistakable. A reminder that despite all the years, something of them had never left that room. That part of the night had stayed behind, patient, waiting. As testimony concluded, the courtroom felt different. Heavier. Not because guilt had been proven, but because denial had grown harder to sustain. The past was no longer abstract. It had been reconstructed piece by piece, not perfectly, but clearly enough to demand a verdict. Closing arguments returned to time. Prosecutors spoke of delay as accident, not absolution. They reminded the jury that the absence of immediate justice does not transform a crime into coincidence. The defense returned to doubt, to caution, to the danger of certainty built too late. Both were right, in different ways. The jury was left to decide which truth mattered more. Deliberations began behind closed doors. Hours passed. Then a day. The city outside moved on, unaware that inside that small room, decades of silence were being weighed sentence by sentence. Jurors argued, revisited evidence, stared at the fingerprint until it felt like it stared back. When they returned, the room went still. The verdict was read aloud, steady, restrained, irreversible. The words carried no celebration, no relief. Just finality. A decision made not in the heat of the moment, but in the cold light of accumulated truth. The case that had slept for decades had reached its reckoning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And still, the story was not over. The courtroom didn't react the way people expect when a verdict lands. There was no gasp, no sudden movement. Just a collective stillness. As if everyone needed a second to understand that time had finally stopped running in circles. The defendant remained seated, expression fixed, absorbing the words as if they were spoken in a foreign language. Guilty. Not as an accusation anymore, but as a conclusion. For the family, the moment felt unreal. Years of imagining this outcome had not prepared them for how quiet it would be. No rush of victory. No sense of restoration. Justice, when it comes late, arrives without ceremony. It doesn't give back what was taken. It only confirms what was lost. The judge thanked the jury, acknowledging the weight of what they had been asked to do. A cold case is a burden passed forward in time, landing on people who had nothing to do with the original failure. They carried it anyway. The law moved next, methodical, indifferent to emotion. Sentencing was scheduled. Procedures resumed. The system, having finally engaged, did what it always does, it kept moving. Outside the courtroom, reporters waited. The headline was already written in their minds. Cold case solved. Forgotten fingerprint. Decades-old murder. Words designed to compress a lifetime of silence into a few sharp lines. The story would circulate for a day, maybe two. Then it would be replaced. That's how attention works. Justice doesn't need an audience to exist, but it rarely keeps one for long. Investigators stood apart, watching the scene with a detachment earned through experience. Satisfaction wasn't the right word. Relief came closer, but even that felt incomplete. They had done their job, but the job had come too late to feel clean. Cold cases teach humility. They remind you that solving something doesn't mean fixing it. The defendant was led away, older now than they had ever imagined they would be when facing consequences. The years that had once shielded them now added weight to the sentence that waited. Time had protected them once. Now it would punish them in a different way. In the days that followed, the case echoed briefly through the city. Former neighbors recognized the address. Old detectives read the article and remembered the file. Some felt vindicated. Others felt regret. What if the technology had come sooner? What if the right question had been asked in 1991? What if someone had looked closer? These questions have no answers. They never do. The family visited the old neighborhood once more. Not the apartment. That door remained closed, but the street. The building stood quietly, unaware of its history. Life flowed around it unchanged. Children played nearby. Cars passed. The city had moved on long ago. Standing there, the family understood something painful but clarifying. Closure doesn't live in places. It lives in acceptance, and acceptance is never complete. Behind the scenes, the cold case unit documented everything. Not for publicity, for precedent. This case would be used to justify reopening others, to argue for funding, to prove that evidence properly preserved can outlast indifference. The forgotten fingerprint became a lesson, a warning, a promise. What you store today may speak tomorrow. The investigator who had reopened the file returned the box to storage, now thinner, lighter, resolved. They paused before sliding it into place, aware of how many others remained untouched. Thousands of lives reduced to folders, waiting for a moment like this one. Some would never get it. That knowledge sat heavy, but it didn't negate what had been achieved. Sentencing arrived without drama. The judge spoke carefully, acknowledging the years lost on both sides of the crime. Accountability was delivered, not as revenge, but as record. The sentence would not restore the past. It would mark it. A line drawn across time, finally acknowledging where responsibility lay. As the courtroom emptied, the family lingered briefly, then left together. Not healed, not whole, but no longer suspended in uncertainty. The question that had haunted them for decades had an answer now. And answers, even painful ones, changed the shape of grief. The city absorbed the outcome the way it absorbs everything, quickly, quietly, without pause. New crimes took over headlines. New tragedies demanded attention. This one slipped back into the background, transformed from mystery into history. But history has weight. It settles into records. It informs choices. It waits. And somewhere, in another filing room, another envelope sat untouched, holding a different truth, patient and unassuming, waiting for the moment when time would finally stop protecting silence and start listening instead. After the sentence was entered into the record, the courtroom emptied the way it always does, slowly at first, then all at once. Benches creaked. Papers were gathered. The machinery of justice powered down without sentiment. What remained was the echo of finality, the sense that something vast had just been compressed into a few typed pages and a clerk's stamp. Outside, the city exhaled and kept going, indifferent to the fact that a question older than many of its buildings had finally been answered. For the family, the days that followed were stranger than the trial itself. There was no longer a calendar date to dread, no next update to wait for. The long vigil was over, and in its place sat an unfamiliar quiet. They discovered that closure doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as space. Space where rage used to live. Space where uncertainty once hummed. That space had to be filled with something else. Memory, routine, the work of continuing. They sorted through belongings long untouched. Old photographs surfaced. Letters. Items boxed away during years when opening them felt unbearable. The victim's life began to reassert itself, no longer defined solely by the way it ended. This, more than the verdict, felt like a reclamation. The case had named a killer, but memory reclaimed a person. Within the department, the case became a reference point. Not a trophy, a benchmark. Detectives spoke about it in briefings, not to celebrate, but to explain process. Preservation mattered. Documentation mattered. The smallest details, a partial print, a note scribbled without confidence, could outlive every assumption made around them. The system had failed once. It had also eventually corrected itself. Both truths were allowed to coexist. The investigator who had reopened the file felt the absence keenly. Solving a cold case creates a vacuum. For years, the puzzle had been a companion, a presence. Now it was gone. In its place rose others, equally silent, equally patient. The lesson wasn't that every case could be solved. It was that every case deserved to be treated as if it might be. The defendant began their sentence in a world smaller than any they had known. Routine replaced anonymity. Time, which had once shielded them, now stretched long and unforgiving. There were no more strategies, no more versions of the story to rehearse. Only the unchanging fact of consequence. For some, that is punishment enough. For others, it is simply a reckoning delayed. Public attention faded quickly. A few follow-up articles ran. A short segment aired late one evening, summarizing the case in minutes. Viewers nodded, surprised, then moved on. That brevity felt cruel to those who had lived with the story for decades, but it was also honest. The world cannot carry every grief indefinitely. It moves, whether we are ready or not. The apartment in Queens remained occupied. Life inside it was ordinary. Dishes in the sink. Music through thin walls. The room where the murder had occurred no longer bore any physical trace of what happened there. That erasure felt unsettling, but also necessary. Spaces are not meant to remain frozen forever. Memory does that work instead. In the records room, the case file was archived with finality. Status changed. Not cold. Closed. The word carried weight. It marked an ending, but also a transformation. From mystery to history. From question to answer. The fingerprint that had waited so long was now referenced in textbooks, training manuals, quiet conversations about patience and progress. Its work was done. And yet, even with the verdict secured, something lingered. A sense of restraint. Of lessons learned too late to save the victim, but not too late to matter. Cold cases teach that justice is not a moment. It is a process stretched across time. Vulnerable to neglect but resilient when tended. The city would produce more crimes. More unsolved questions. More boxes waiting in darkness. This case did not change that reality. What it changed was perception. Proof that silence is not permanence. That evidence, properly held, can outweigh denial. That the past does not expire simply because we stop looking at it. As the years continued to turn, the story would resurface occasionally. In lectures, in training, in quiet conversations between detectives who understood the cost of delay. It would be told not as legend, but as reminder. That even in a city famous for forgetting, some truths refused to disappear. And somewhere, far from courtrooms and headlines, the echo of a door frame touched in 1991 finally faded. Its testimony complete, leaving behind a city that had, at last, listened. Years later, the city no longer remembered the day the verdict was read. It remembered the traffic, the weather, the headlines that replaced it the following week. New York has always been expert at stacking one story on top of another, until the weight of the present crushes the past. And yet, beneath that constant forward motion, the case continued to breathe, not loudly, not publicly, but in the quiet places where unresolved history tends to linger. In police academies, an instructor would pause mid-lecture and lower their voice, speaking about a fingerprint lifted without ceremony, catalogued without hope, preserved by habit rather than belief. Recruits would nod half listening, until the implication landed. Evidence is patient. It does not need faith. It only needs time, and someone willing to return. In Queens, neighbors who had lived on the block in 1991 grew older. Some moved away. Some passed on. Those who remained told the story differently now. Not with fear, but with distance. The apartment was no longer the place where it happened. It was just an address again. The shock had thinned. Worn smooth by decades of normal life layered on top of violence. That too was a kind of survival. The family learned how to speak about the victim without immediately invoking the murder. That took the longest. For years, every memory had ended the same way. Now slowly the ending shifted. Stories stopped before the night everything went wrong. Laughter returned to the narrative. It felt like betrayal at first. Then it felt like permission. The solved case did not erase the years of not knowing. Nothing could. It simply gave those years a frame. A beginning. A middle. An end. Humans crave that shape, even when the content is unbearable. Especially then. But cold cases are never just about one file. They ripple outward, touching others still waiting in darkness. Detectives reopened boxes. Analysts reran prints. Families made phone calls they had stopped believing would ever matter. Not every case answered back. Some remained silent. Some always would. The lesson was not that justice is guaranteed. Only that it is possible. The fingerprint itself became almost mythical in retelling, stripped of its mundane reality. In truth, it was imperfect. Smudged. Partial. Easily dismissed. Its power lay not in clarity, but in endurance. It survived moves, floods, policy changes, and indifference. It outlived assumptions. That is how truth often behaves. It waits. The defendant faded from public consciousness entirely. Their name became a line in a database, a footnote in a training slide. Whatever story they told themselves in the years between crime and capture no longer mattered. Time, which had once hidden them, had ultimately betrayed them. It always does. On anniversaries, the city did not pause. It never had. But somewhere, a person would stop at a crosswalk, stare at a familiar building, and feel the faint tug of a memory they couldn't quite name. The echo of a life interrupted. The sense that something once went terribly wrong here. And that it took far too long to say so out loud. Cold cases teach patience to those who work them and humility to those who close them. They remind us that certainty is fragile, that progress is uneven, that answers sometimes arrive long after the cost has been paid. They also remind us that forgetting is not the same as forgiveness, and silence is not the same as peace. The file now rests in a different section. Finalized. Resolved. But resolution is a technical term. Emotional truth resists categorization. It spills beyond verdicts and dates and neat conclusions. It lives in the people left behind, in the habits formed by waiting, in the way a city absorbs tragedy and keeps moving. In New York, the night still hums. Footsteps echo. Doors close. Somewhere, a surface is being touched that will one day matter. Somewhere, a detail is being overlooked, logged, stored. Somewhere, the future is already collecting the evidence it will need. And deep in the archives, among thousands of stories that did not end quickly or cleanly, one fingerprint finally rests. No longer a question, no longer a hope, but a quiet reminder that even after decades of darkness, the past can still reach forward and demand to be seen. Time does not stop when a case is closed. It simply changes texture. What once felt sharp becomes dull, then distant, then oddly heavy again when least expected. Long after the paperwork was filed and the courtroom emptied, the story continued to exist in fragments, scattered across a city that never agreed to remember it all at once. A retired detective would wake before dawn, coffee cooling on the table, staring at nothing in particular, his mind drifting back to the sound of paper folders sliding across a desk. He no longer worked the job, no longer carried a badge. Yet the muscle memory remained. The instinct to notice what others ignored. The habit of asking one more question. Solving the case hadn't erased the years it occupied his thoughts. It had only rearranged them. In a storage facility miles away, shelves sagged under the weight of evidence from other lives, other nights, other unanswered calls. Boxes labeled in block letters waited without complaint. Some would be opened again. Some never would. This was the quiet truth no press release ever mentioned. That resolution is selective. That for every solved cold case, dozens remain suspended in time, held together by hope and dust. Families still waiting followed the story closely when it broke. They memorized details. The fingerprint. The database. The arrest after decades. For some, it felt like a promise. For others, like a cruel tease. If it could happen there, why not here? The question lingered unanswered, heavy as smoke. The city itself absorbed the case the way it absorbs everything, imperfectly. New buildings rose. Old ones vanished. Streets were renamed. The neighborhood where it began no longer resembled its former self. Yet history has a way of embedding itself beneath renovations, beneath fresh paint and polished floors. It does not disappear. It sinks. Some nights, a late-shift patrol officer would pass the old address and feel an inexplicable tightening in their chest. They might not know the full story. They might not know it at all. But places remember. They hold on to energy long after people move on, long after headlines fade. The victim's name appeared occasionally in unexpected places. A citation in a legal journal, a footnote in a forensic study, a quiet acknowledgement in a training seminar. Each appearance stripped the name further from the person it once belonged to, transforming a life into a lesson. Necessary, perhaps, but never complete. Those closest to the victim learned to live with that duality. Pride that the case mattered, sorrow that it had to. They learned that public resolution does not translate to private peace. That justice answers a question, but it does not ask how you plan to live afterward. There were moments when the solved case felt almost unreal, as if the years of uncertainty had been a different life altogether. Memory blurred the edges. Details softened. The mind, always eager to protect itself, began rewriting certain moments. Trauma does that. It edits. And still, the fingerprint remained unchanged. Frozen in time. The same ridges. The same breaks. It did not evolve the way memory did. It did not forget. That contrast unsettled those who thought about it too long. How something so small, so indifferent, could carry so much weight while humans struggled to hold the same clarity. Cold cases expose a simple truth that few like to admit. Time does not heal. It only delays. It gives space. Space for technology to advance. Space for people to talk. Space for mistakes to surface. The passage of years is not mercy. It is opportunity. In the months after the case was officially closed, tips slowed to nothing. Then quietly they began again, not about this crime but others. The story had loosened something. Encouraged voices long silent. Some callers were confused. Some were wrong. A few were precise in a way that made investigators sit up straighter. The ripple effect was real, even if invisible to the public. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from reopening the past. Detectives know it well. You step into someone else's worst day and stay there, sometimes for years. When a case finally resolves, the exhaustion doesn't vanish. It waits. It demands acknowledgement. The solved cold case became a reference, a symbol, a cautionary tale. It was invoked when budgets were debated, when evidence rooms were audited, when someone argued that old files were a waste of resources. It stood as proof that neglect has consequences, and so does persistence. Yet no matter how often the case was cited, it resisted becoming inspirational. It was never a feel-good story. It was a delayed reckoning. A correction made long after the damage had spread. Anyone paying close attention understood that. At night, the city still whispered. Sirens. Footsteps. Voices carried through open windows. Somewhere, a crime was unfolding that would not be solved quickly. Somewhere, evidence was being collected with care. Or not enough. Somewhere, a future cold case was being born. And somewhere else, a family slept with the knowledge that their question had an answer at last. Not the one they wanted, not one that brought relief, but one that refused to let the past remain undefined. That mattered more than it seemed. Because unresolved stories have a way of haunting everyone, not just those directly involved. They erode trust. They teach resignation. Solved cases push back against that erosion, even imperfectly, even too late. The fingerprint that cracked the case did not restore a life. It did not rewind a single moment. What it did was simpler and heavier. It forced the truth into the open. It refused to let time win completely. And in a city built on reinvention, on speed, on forgetting yesterday by tomorrow morning, that refusal carried its own quiet power. A reminder that some stories do not fade. They wait, patient and unmoving, until the moment someone finally looks closely enough to see what was always there. There is a moment, long after a case is closed, when it stops feeling like news and starts feeling like weather. Always present. Rarely discussed. It settles into the background of lives that learn to function beneath its shadow. The New York 1991 cold case reached that stage quietly, without ceremony, absorbed into the city's collective memory the way countless other tragedies had been before it. For investigators still working active cases, the story surfaced at unexpected times. Late nights. Empty precinct floors. A junior detective hesitating before discarding a piece of evidence that seemed insignificant. Someone would mention the fingerprint, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to remind everyone in the room that the line between useless and essential is thinner than it appears. That hesitation alone felt like progress. Technology continued to advance, indifferent to the human cost that necessitated it. Databases expanded. Algorithms refined themselves. The tools that finally cracked the case grew more precise, more powerful, but also more dependent on the integrity of what had been saved decades earlier. The past, once again, dictated the limits of the future. The solved case began to influence policy in subtle ways. Evidence rooms were audited more thoroughly. Retention schedules were revised. Training emphasized patience over intuition. Documentation over assumption. None of these changes were announced as tributes. They were simply corrections, implemented quietly, as if acknowledging the debt too loudly might reopen wounds no one wanted exposed. The victim's story, stripped of speculation at last, remained complicated. Knowing who committed the crime did not explain why it happened the way it did. Motive, even when outlined in court, felt thin compared to the damage it left behind. That gap, between explanation and understanding, never closed. It didn't need to. Some questions exist only to remind us of limits. In the community, the emotional temperature cooled further. Conversations shifted. The case was no longer spoken about with urgency, but with a kind of weary familiarity. People remembered where they were when the news broke all those years later. They remembered the shock, the disbelief, the sense that time itself had glitched. Then life resumed as it always does. The family noticed the shift too. Invitations stopped including condolences. Their loss, once public again, slowly returned to being private. That transition was harder than they expected. Grief had become a shared language for so long that its disappearance felt isolating. Closure, they learned, can be lonely. They continued their routines. Work, meals, ordinary arguments, ordinary joys. The solved case did not define these moments, but it hovered nearby, a silent witness to resilience no verdict could measure. Healing did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as habit. In academic circles, the fingerprint case was debated with clinical detachment. Chain of custody, preservation standards, database lag. Each discussion distilled human suffering into variables and outcomes. Necessary perhaps, but always incomplete. Those who had lived the story knew that the most critical factors, fear, fatigue, doubt, never made it into charts or slides. Cold cases occupy a strange moral space. They demand attention long after urgency fades. They ask institutions to care when incentives no longer exist. The New York case had survived that neglect, but it did not pretend the neglect hadn't mattered. It wore the delay like a scar. Somewhere in the city, a new detective opened an old file for the first time. The smell of aging paper, the weight of unresolved history. They didn't know yet whether this case would end in answers or silence. They only knew that it deserved to be treated seriously. That alone felt like a small victory owed to those who came before. The fingerprint, now famous in professional circles, remained exactly what it had always been, a fragment. It did not tell a story. It did not express intent. It simply existed, unchanged, waiting for the world to catch up. In that way, it was less evidence than accusation. Proof that time alone does not equal justice. As years continued to pass, anniversaries lost their sharpness. Dates blurred. Memory softened around the edges. What remained was the lesson, distilled and stubborn. That answers can arrive late. That truth does not expire. That the past is not finished simply because we stop paying attention to it. The city kept humming. Sirens echoed. Subways rattled beneath streets layered with forgotten footsteps. Somewhere, someone touched a surface without knowing it mattered. Somewhere else, a detail was overlooked, logged, stored, misunderstood. The future continued assembling its own questions. And in the deep background of it all, the New York 1991 cold case existed not as a triumph, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder that justice is fragile, memory is unreliable, and sometimes the smallest surviving trace is the only thing willing to wait long enough to tell the truth. There is an afterlife to solved cases that few people talk about, a long quiet stretch where the noise has faded but the weight has not. The New York 1991 cold case entered that phase without announcement, slipping into the city's subconscious, present but rarely acknowledged, like an old scar you only notice when the weather changes. For those who had worked it, the case began to surface in dreams. Not as violence, not as faces, but as process. Endless corridors. Stacks of files that never seemed to thin. A sense of moving forward while standing perfectly still. The mind replayed the years of waiting more vividly than the moment of resolution. Victory, when it finally comes, is brief. The vigil is what endures. The fingerprint continued its strange second life, no longer locked away, but circulating through presentations and internal memos, stripped of context, reduced to pixels and annotations. To new eyes, it looked almost unimpressive, incomplete, messy, easy to overlook. That was its power. It had survived precisely because no one expected it to matter. Administrators spoke about efficiency now, about modern systems that would never allow such delays again. The words sounded reassuring, almost hopeful. Those who had lived through the case listened carefully and said little. Systems fail quietly, they knew. Not all at once. Not dramatically. They fail through shortcuts, assumptions, and the belief that time will smooth over mistakes. This case existed as proof that it never does. In the victim's family, conversations about the future slowly outnumbered conversations about the past. This shift felt disorienting at first. Planning holidays, talking about moves, making decisions not anchored to grief. It felt like stepping into a life that had been postponed without asking permission. Guilt surfaced, then receded. Survival demanded adaptation. They noticed how others interacted with them differently now. Less caution. Fewer lowered voices. The tragedy had returned to being theirs alone. Public empathy has an expiration date. Once justice is declared, the world assumes healing follows automatically. Those who know better rarely correct that assumption. It is easier to let silence do the explaining. The defendants' appeals were filed, denied, forgotten. Legal language reduced decades of consequence to paragraphs and citations. There was no drama left in it, no suspense. Just procedure grinding forward, indifferent and thorough. This too was part of closure. The slow normalization of what once felt impossible. Cold cases do not end cleanly. They taper. They dissolve into policy changes, altered behavior, quiet resolve. The New York case changed how evidence was handled, how long it was kept, how often it was reviewed. These changes did not bring comfort to the past, but they shifted the future slightly off its original course. Sometimes that is all justice can offer. The city, meanwhile, continued to erase and rebuild itself. A storefront near the original scene closed. Another opened. Different faces passed through the same doorway, unaware of the history beneath their feet. There is something unsettling about that ignorance, and something merciful. Not every place needs to remember everything. Late at night, when the streets thinned and the noise softened, the story felt closer, as if the city itself acknowledged the weight it carried during daylight hours. The solved case did not haunt in the traditional sense. It lingered, a low hum beneath the surface of things, reminding anyone listening closely that time does not absolve, it only postpones. You could trace the case's influence in small behaviors. A detective double-checking a label. A technician refusing to discard a partial sample. A supervisor approving overtime for a review no one expected to lead anywhere. These moments never made headlines, but they mattered more than any press conference ever could. The fingerprint had done its job, but it had also changed expectations. It stood as evidence not just of guilt, but of endurance. Of the idea that truth, even neglected, even doubted, can remain intact long enough to matter. That idea unsettled some people, comforted others. As years continued to pile up, the case stopped being referenced by date and started being referenced by lesson. Not the 1991 murder, but that one that came back. That phrasing said everything. The past has a way of returning when you assume it has finally been buried. And in the spaces between conversations, between cases, between lives moving forward, the New York 1991 cold case remained what it had always been at its core. A reminder that justice is not swift, memory is not reliable, and sometimes the only thing that refuses to forget is a trace left behind by someone who never got the chance to explain themselves. Eventually, even the lessons begin to fade into routine. What was once cited with gravity becomes shorthand, then habit, then background noise in a system always chasing the next urgency. The New York 1991 cold case reached that stage quietly, not because it stopped mattering, but because its influence had already seeped into the walls. New detectives entered the job with no memory of the night it began, no emotional connection to the headlines that would surface decades later. To them, the case existed as a reference point, a line in a manual, a story told without drama during late training sessions. And yet, without realizing it, they carried its weight forward in the way they worked. Slower when needed, more careful with what others might dismiss. The evidence rooms changed over time. Brighter lights, digital logs, Climate controls calibrated to the decimal. These upgrades looked impressive on paper, but the real change was invisible. A cultural shift. A reluctance to throw anything away too quickly. A shared understanding that certainty is dangerous when it comes too easily. Somewhere in that transition, the fingerprint lost its myth. It became normalized, absorbed into the broader language of forensic success. That was inevitable. Symbols rarely survive prolonged exposure to reality. But even stripped of its mystique, it continued to exert pressure. A quiet insistence that patience can outlast neglect. The family marked another year without fanfare. No public statements. No interviews. Just a private acknowledgement that time had moved again, as it always does. They spoke less about the crime now, not because it hurt less, but because it no longer needed to be spoken to be understood. Grief had settled into a shape they recognized. There were moments when anger resurfaced unexpectedly. At the delay. At the systems that failed. At the years that could not be reclaimed. Those moments passed, not resolved but managed. Healing, they learned, was not about erasing the wound. It was about learning where it still hurt, and adjusting how you moved. In the city, other cold cases remained unresolved, their files growing heavier as the years accumulated. Families watched and waited. Some clung to the New York case like a talisman. Proof that silence does not always mean defeat. Others looked at it and felt only exhaustion. Hope is not universally comforting. Sometimes it demands too much. The case had changed the conversation, but not the reality. Justice was still uneven. Attention still selective. Resources still finite. What had shifted was the refusal to declare something impossible simply because it was old. That refusal mattered. Late one night, a detective closed a file and hesitated, hand hovering over the shelf. The case felt thin, unpromising, almost certainly destined to remain unanswered. Almost. The hesitation lasted only a second, but it was enough. The file stayed. Another year bought. Another chance preserved. This was how legacies truly functioned. Not in grand gestures, but in brief moments of doubt where someone chose not to give up yet. The fingerprint, archived and replicated, no longer bore the physical wear of time. Digitized versions were crisp, precise, endlessly reproducible. But the original remained, locked away, unchanged, carrying the quiet gravity of having been there when everything went wrong. It did not know it had become important. It never had. As the city slept, unaware and unburdened, the solved case continued its quiet work, shaping instincts, influencing decisions, haunting just enough to matter. Not loudly, not dramatically, persistently. Because the truth about cold cases is not that they are about the past. They are about the future, about what we choose to protect, what we are willing to wait for, and how long we allow silence to stand in for answers. The New York 1991 cold case no longer needed attention. It had already done what it came back to do. It had reminded a restless city that time does not erase responsibility, that evidence remembers what people forget, and that sometimes the smallest mark left behind is the only thing strong enough to pull the truth out of the dark and hold it there. Silence returned in a different form after everything that could be said had already been spoken. Not the heavy silence of uncertainty, not the suffocating quiet of unanswered questions, but a thinner, more fragile kind. The silence that follows acknowledgement. The New York 1991 cold case settled into that space, no longer demanding attention, yet never fully releasing its grip. For those who had lived with it the longest, memory began to reorganize itself. Events once recalled in sharp, painful detail softened at the edges, not because they were forgotten, but because the mind finally allowed them to rest. Certain images faded. Others remained stubbornly clear. The night. The phone call. The moment when hope had first slipped away. Time did not erase these memories. It simply stopped adding new ones. Within the department, turnover continued. Desks changed hands. Names on office doors disappeared and reappeared. Institutional memory thinned as it always does, passed down imperfectly through anecdotes and warnings. Yet the case left behind a residue. An instinctive caution when dealing with the overlooked, the incomplete, the almost disposable. That instinct could not be quantified, but it endured. There were conversations that never made it into any report, quiet acknowledgments between colleagues, regrets shared without needing explanation, admissions that came too late to change anything but still demanded to be voiced. The case had created space for those conversations. That alone felt significant. In the wider world, technology marched forward, promising faster answers, cleaner results, fewer mistakes. The solved cold case was often cited as proof of progress, but those closest to it knew better. Progress had not solved the case. Preservation had. Patience had. The simple refusal to throw something away had mattered more than any algorithm. The family noticed how strangers spoke to them now, when the subject came up at all. Less curiosity, less urgency, more distance. The story had become historical, safely contained in the past. They learned to navigate that distance, to accept that the rest of the world could move on more easily than they ever could. That was not cruelty. It was survival. There were nights when sleep came easily, and nights when it didn't. Closure had not rewritten biology. The body remembered stress even when the mind tried to let go. Years of waiting had carved habits into muscle and nerve. Letting go was not an event. It was a practice. Somewhere in the city, a journalist stumbled across the case while researching something else. They read the old articles, then the new ones, struck by the gap between them. Decades collapsed into paragraphs. The story felt unreal, almost fictional, until they reached the smallest detail, the fingerprint. That detail anchored everything. It reminded them that this had happened, that someone had died, that time had passed anyway. Cold cases, when solved, create an illusion of symmetry. A beginning, a middle, an end. The truth is messier. The ending does not align neatly with the beginning. It lands wherever it can, often far from where it started. The New York case ended in a courtroom, but it began and continued in living rooms, hallways, and quiet nights that never made the record. The apartment where it began was renovated again. New paint. New fixtures. No marker. No plaque. Nothing to indicate that a life had been taken there. Some might have found that wrong. Others found it merciful. Places, like people, need the chance to become something else. In the archives, the case file rested among thousands of others, indistinguishable at a glance. Its spine no longer screamed urgency. It simply existed, complete at last. That completeness felt strange, almost unsettling, to those who remembered it unfinished. Questions, once answered, lose their sharpness. Answers, once delivered, lose their power to surprise. And yet, the case refused to become meaningless. It lingered in small decisions, in moments of hesitation, in the quiet insistence that nothing should be dismissed too quickly. That insistence was its legacy. Because long after headlines fade and verdicts settle, what remains is not the solution itself, but the change it forces, in how people look, how long they are willing to wait, and how seriously they treat the traces left behind by those who never got to finish telling their story. The New York 1991 cold case no longer asked to be remembered. It had already done its work. It waited instead, folded into the city's rhythm. A subdued but permanent reminder that the past does not vanish, it recedes, and that sometimes, even after decades of silence, it still expects to be taken seriously. By the time the case stopped being mentioned at all, it had fully crossed into something deeper than memory. It became instinct, a reflex embedded so quietly that no one thought to name it. The New York 1991 cold case no longer needed to be recalled. It had already altered the way absence was interpreted, the way silence was treated, the way time itself was questioned. In precincts across the city, younger officers learned without being taught. They lingered a second longer at scenes that felt too clean. They hesitated before dismissing fragments that didn't fit. They logged details they couldn't yet justify. None of them cited a reason. None of them referenced the case. They simply felt, on some level, that leaving something behind unfinished carried a cost. The past had taught them that neglect is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in through fatigue, through certainty, through the comfort of moving on. The 1991 case had survived precisely because someone at some point had resisted that comfort. That resistance, small and unremarkable at the time, had echoed forward. The family continued aging in a world that no longer paused for their story. Birthdays arrived. Milestones passed. New griefs joined the old one, as they always do. The solved case did not protect them from loss. It only changed the shape of one loss among many. That change mattered, even if it never felt complete. Sometimes, without warning, a familiar sound or smell would pull them backward. The hum of a refrigerator late at night. The echo of footsteps in a hallway. Memory does not respect chronology. It arrives when it wants, uninvited and unedited. They learn not to fight it. They let it pass through, trusting that it no longer defined everything. The defendant's existence faded into institutional routine. Transfers. Reviews. Years marked by forms and numbers. Whatever narrative they once believed in dissolved into repetition. History had caught up and then moved past. Consequence once delayed became ordinary. There was no catharsis in that. Only inevitability. Elsewhere, other families continued waiting. Their stories unfolded differently. Some would end in answers. Some would not. The New York case did not promise resolution. It only demonstrated that silence is not proof of absence. That alone changed how waiting felt. Less hopeless, more vigilant. Cold cases do not belong to a single moment. They stretch across generations, carried by people who inherit the question without inheriting the context. The 1991 case had completed that journey. It began as shock, hardened into mystery, and ended as warning. Not a warning about crime, but about forgetting. The fingerprint that had waited so long was no longer extraordinary. It had been absorbed into the system, cataloged, referenced, normalized. But normalization did not diminish its meaning. It clarified it. The truth had never depended on drama. It had depended on survival. In the end, the case did not change the city's pace. New York remained relentless, forward-facing, impatient with yesterday. What it changed was subtler. A crack in the assumption that time solves everything. A reminder that some answers do not arrive unless they are preserved, protected, and allowed to endure neglect. Long after the last article was archived, long after the last training slide was updated, the influence remained. In a hand that hesitated. In a file that stayed open. In a detail that refused to be discarded. Because the real legacy of the New York 1991 cold case was not the moment it was solved, but the years it refused to disappear. The decades it spent waiting, unchanged, for someone to notice that the past was still present, still intact, still demanding to be taken seriously. And somewhere, deep in storage, beneath layers of other stories still waiting their turn, the record rests. Not as an ending, not as closure, but as proof that even after years of darkness, the truth does not weaken. It waits.